Was it really them? Are we sure that's who was buried? What if history got it wrong? Number 6. The mystery of Jesse James. Did America's most notorious outlaw fake his own death? Jesse James, the legendary Wild West bandit, was supposedly killed on April 3, 1882, when Robert Ford shot him in the back of the head at James's home in St. Joseph, Missouri. Ford, who was part of James's gang, killed him to collect the substantial reward money offered by the governor of Missouri. The death of Jesse James became instant American folklore. His body was identified by several people who knew him well, including his wife and mother. He was buried in the yard of his family farm before being moved to a cemetery in Kearney, Missouri, where tourists still visit his grave today. But almost immediately, rumors began circulating that James had somehow escaped death. Over the years, dozens of men came forward claiming to be the real Jesse James who had faked his death and escaped. The most famous was J. Frank Dalton, who in 1948, at the age of 101, declared he was the real Jesse James. Dalton claimed that another member of the gang was killed in his place and that he had lived under various aliases for decades. He offered specific details about James's life and even had scars that matched those known to be on James's body. The Dalton claim became so persistent that in 1995, the body in Jesse James's grave was exhumed for DNA testing. Scientists compared DNA from the remains with known descendants of James's sister. The results confirmed that the body in the grave was indeed Jesse James, seemingly putting the century-old mystery to rest. But that hasn't stopped the conspiracy theories. Some maintain that the testing was flawed or that the grave had been tampered with long before the exhumation. The legend of Jesse James had become so powerful that many people simply wanted to believe he had outsmarted the law one final time. The case of Jesse James represents America's fascination with outlaws who might have escaped justice, living on as ghosts in the margins of history, watching as the world mourned someone else buried in their place. Number 5. The tangled fate of Martin Bormann. Did Hitler's right-hand man escape to South America or die in Berlin? Martin Bormann was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, serving as Adolf Hitler's private secretary and head of the Nazi Party Chancellery. As the Third Reich collapsed in the final days of World War II, Bormann vanished. For decades after the war, his fate remained one of the most intriguing mysteries of the Nazi era. Bormann was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death in 1946. Because his body had not been found, rumors flourished about his escape. Alleged Bormann sightings were reported in South America, particularly in Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile, where other Nazi fugitives had found refuge. The case became even more complicated when various intelligence agencies seemed to validate some of these sightings. The hunt for Bormann became one of the longest manhunts in history, with Nazi hunters, journalists, and intelligence agencies from multiple countries involved in tracking down leads. In 1972, during construction work in Berlin near the Leader train station, workers discovered 2 skeletons. German authorities claimed that one of them was Bormann, identified through dental records and injuries that matched what was known about him. According to this finding, Bormann had died while trying to escape Berlin on May 2, 1945, possibly by taking a cyanide capsule when surrounded by Soviet forces. Many remain skeptical, however. The identification methods used in 1972 weren't as sophisticated as modern techniques, and the Cold War politics of the time created an atmosphere of distrust around official declarations. It wasn't until 1998 that German authorities announced that DNA testing had conclusively identified the remains as those of Martin Bormann. The DNA was compared with samples from a relative of Bormann, finally bringing a scientific conclusion to the decades-long mystery. Yet despite this evidence, some historians and conspiracy theorists maintain that the DNA testing could have been manipulated or that the wrong body was tested. The decades of uncertainty and the numerous reported sightings created a mythology around Bormann that proved difficult to dispel, even with scientific evidence. The Bormann case is a perfect example of how political figures who disappear under chaotic circumstances can become the subject of elaborate identity confusion, especially when powerful forces might have an interest in either capturing them or helping them escape. Number 4. The disputed remains of Christopher Columbus. Where does the great explorer truly rest? Christopher Columbus, the Italian explorer credited with discovering the Americas for the Spanish crown, died in Valladolid, Spain, in 1506. Yet today, two countries claim to have his remains, Spain and the Dominican Republic. After his death, Columbus was initially buried in Valladolid, but his son Diego had his remains moved to Seville. In 1542, the remains were transported to Santo Domingo, in what is now the Dominican Republic, to fulfill Columbus's wish to be buried in the New World. When the Spanish lost control of the island to the French in 1795, they decided to remove what they believed were Columbus's remains to Havana, Cuba. After Spain lost control of Cuba following the Spanish-American War, the remains were moved back to Seville, where they currently rest in an elaborate tomb in the cathedral. But the story doesn't end there. In 1877, workers restoring the Santo Domingo Cathedral discovered a lead box inscribed with "Illustrious and Distinguished Male, Don Cristobal Colon," which contained human remains. Dominican authorities claimed these were the real remains of Columbus, suggesting that the Spanish had taken the wrong body in 1795. Both Spain and the Dominican Republic have steadfastly maintained that they possess the authentic remains of the explorer. The Dominican Republic built a massive monument called the Columbus Lighthouse, where their set of remains is kept. In 2003, Spanish researchers conducted DNA tests on the remains in Seville, comparing them with the DNA of Columbus's brother Diego, whose identity is not disputed. The test showed that at least some of the remains in Seville belonged to Columbus. However, the Dominican Republic has refused to allow their remains to be tested, keeping the controversy alive. Some historians have suggested that Columbus's remains might actually be split between the two locations, as it was common practice in the medieval period to divide the remains of important figures among different sites. The dispute over Columbus's final resting place reflects the complicated legacy of a man whose voyages forever changed the course of world history. Both Spain and the Dominican Republic claim a connection to the explorer through his physical remains, turning what should be a simple historical fact into a matter of national pride and identity. Number 3. The execution of Timothy Evans or John Christie. Did an innocent man hang while a serial killer walked free? Timothy Evans was a Welsh van driver who was hanged in 1950 for the murder of his wife Beryl and their baby daughter Geraldine. Evans had confessed to the crimes after intense police questioning, though he later retracted his confession and accused his downstairs neighbor, John Christie, of the murders. Christie was a key prosecution witness at Evans's trial, testifying against him. After Evans's execution, Christie continued living at the now infamous address, 10 Rillington Place in London's Notting Hill neighborhood. 3 years after Evans was hanged, the horrifying truth emerged. Christie was revealed to be a serial killer when bodies were discovered hidden in his apartment and garden, including the remains of his own wife. Christie was arrested, tried, and executed in 1953. The shocking revelation prompted questions about Evans's conviction. Had an innocent man been executed while the real killer testified against him? The case became one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in British legal history and played a significant role in the movement to abolish capital punishment in the UK. The Evans case was particularly disturbing because of the mistaken identity aspect, not of the victim, but of the perpetrator. Evans, who had limited intelligence and was easily confused under pressure, was identified as a murderer, while Christie, the actual serial killer, was identified as a respectable witness. After decades of campaigning by Evans's family and opponents of capital punishment, he was granted a posthumous pardon in 1966. In 2004, the British Home Office officially recognized that Evans had been wrongfully executed. The case remains one of the most famous examples of mistaken criminal identity with fatal consequences. The wrong man was executed while the real killer remained free to continue his crimes. The address 10 Rillington Place became so notorious that the street was later renamed and the house demolished. The Evans Christie case demonstrates how easy it can be for authorities to establish the wrong narrative when under pressure to solve shocking crimes, especially when a convincing alternative suspect is right there helping to direct suspicion elsewhere. Number 2, the fate of Grand Duchess Anastasia. Did a Russian princess survive the execution of the royal family? When Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed by Bolshevik forces in July 1918 during the Russian Revolution, rumors quickly spread that the youngest daughter, Grand Duchess Anastasia, had somehow survived the massacre. The execution of the Romanov family was carried out in secret, and the location of their remains was concealed for decades. This lack of physical evidence, combined with the romantic notion of a young princess escaping death, created the perfect conditions for one of history's most enduring identity mysteries. In 1920, a woman who later became known as Anna Anderson was rescued from a canal in Berlin after a suicide attempt. While recovering in a mental hospital, she began claiming that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia. Anderson maintained this claim until her death in 1984, gathering both supporters and detractors along the way. Some who had known the real Anastasia, including members of the Russian aristocracy in exile, believed Anderson's claim. They pointed to physical similarities, knowledge of intimate Romanov family details, and personality traits that matched those of the Grand Duchess. Others, including many Romanov family members, dismissed Anderson as an imposter. They noted inconsistencies in her stories and her inability to speak Russian fluently, something the real Anastasia would have had no trouble with. The Anderson case became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring books, films, and plays. The 1956 film Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman, who won an Oscar for her portrayal, was based on Anderson's claim, helping to cement the story in popular culture. The mystery appeared to be solved in 1991 when the remains of the Romanov family were discovered in a forest near Yekaterinburg, Russia. Initial DNA testing confirmed their identities but found that 2 bodies were missing, those of Alexei, the Tsar's son, and one of his daughters. Some used this finding to suggest that the missing daughter was Anastasia, keeping Anderson's claim alive. However, in 2007, a second burial site was discovered containing the remains of 2 young individuals, consistent with being the missing Romanov children. DNA testing in 2009 conclusively identified all the Romanov family members and proved that Anderson could not have been Anastasia. In fact, further DNA testing revealed that Anderson was actually Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker. The Anastasia case demonstrates how political upheaval and incomplete information can create lasting mysteries about the fate of prominent figures. It also shows the powerful appeal of stories where vulnerable young people escape tragic fates, so powerful that they can override rational evidence and persist for generations. Number 1, the death of Adolf Hitler. Did the Nazi leader escape Berlin in history's greatest disappearing act? Adolf Hitler's death in his Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Nazi capital, was initially surrounded by confusion and uncertainty. While Western intelligence quickly concluded that Hitler had committed suicide alongside his new wife Eva Braun, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin publicly claimed that Hitler had escaped. This deliberate misinformation by Stalin, possibly intended to embarrass his Western allies or justify the continued occupation of Germany, helped fuel decades of conspiracy theories about Hitler's fate. The Soviet army did recover what they believed to be Hitler's remains, parts of a jaw and skull fragment with a bullet hole, but kept this evidence secret for decades. The uncertainty was compounded by the fact that Hitler had ordered his body to be burned after death to prevent it from being displayed like that of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Soviet forces found burned remains outside the bunker, but initially struggled to make a definitive identification. In the vacuum of reliable information, alleged Hitler sightings proliferated, particularly in South America where other Nazi officials had indeed fled. The FBI accumulated thousands of pages of reports about possible Hitler sightings in Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil. Some theories suggested he had escaped by submarine to a secret Nazi base in Antarctica or had plastic surgery to disguise his appearance. These theories gained traction because several high-ranking Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, did successfully escape to South America. If they could evade justice, why not Hitler himself? The official Soviet version, finally released after the fall of the USSR, was that Hitler's partially burned remains had been recovered, positively identified, secretly buried, exhumed, and then thoroughly cremated, with the ashes finally disposed of in a river in 1970 to prevent his burial site from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. In 2018, French researchers were granted access to the skull fragment and teeth that the Russians had preserved. Dental analysis compared these remains with Hitler's dental records and confirmed they belonged to the Nazi leader, seemingly putting the escape theories to rest. Yet despite this scientific evidence, the Hitler survival myth persists in certain circles. The combination of initial Soviet misinformation, the chaos of Berlin's fall, and the human tendency to believe that villains somehow escape justice has kept the mystery alive in popular imagination. The Hitler death controversy shows how the identities of history's most notorious figures can become contested when physical evidence is limited, political agendas interfere with fact-finding, and the public is psychologically resistant to simple conclusions about complex historical figures. Was it really them in those burial sites? How many more historical graves contain someone other than who we think? And what happens to history when we can't even be sure who's buried where?